Assalamu alaikum once again to everyone. I welcome you all to the expert talk of today, which is based on Hamas. We have titled it in a way that last time we had a discussion a couple of weeks ago regarding the current diplomatic resurgence that has been happening with regards to the Palestinian cause. We had Dr. Asim Qureshi and Professor Salman Saeed. And after that discussion, after we had a brief meeting regarding the discussion, we came to this conclusion that it's high time we have a discussion on the crucial topic of Hamas and the history of resistance. So when we were thinking about the speakers or the guests who should be invited, the first name that came to our minds were of Dr. Azzam Tamimi. I think we don't need any introduction because we all know, uh, but especially my personal encounter with Hamas, the form of literature. It took place with the work of Dr. Azzam Tamimi. So, for all of you who doesn't know him, he is a Palestinian academic as well as a political activist who has been vocal about the Palestinian cause as well as the history of Hamas. He has written a wonderful work, which is actually a history of the formation of Hamas and its several milestones, which was published which was published in last decade. If I remember, it was in 2007. Am I right?
Yes, you're right. Yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Currently, he is the editor in chief of Aliwa TV, and he has also headed the Institute of Islamic Political Thought. Also, he has written extensively on Middle East and the politics of Middle East, the region, especially his works on Rashid Ghanouchi as well as his works on Islam and secularism. So, without any delay, I welcome Dr. Azzam Tamimi to today's talk. So, before we begin, let me give you a brief background of what we are going to discuss today. So, to all of you, we know a lot has been talked about the history of the conflict as well as the history of the resistance. Talking about the people who support the Palestinian cause, we come across a lot of ifs and buts, and for many of them, their encounter with the Palestinian question is merely about the recent chain of events. And even the people who read and learn the history of the region and the conflict, they fail to get into the nuances of understanding the struggle for liberation. So many among of those who understand the birth of Israel as well as the conflict in the region as a child of colonialism, and those who call for decolonization, they stick to a language which is very much limited to the framework of the colonialist tendencies. And we find the urge to secularize the resistance and belittle the place of Islam in the resistance, especially with regards to Hamas, especially when it comes to the question of Hamas, where the place of religion or the place of Islam is portrayed or discussed merely as a tool or an instrument to reach other goals. So it comes from a very enlightenment laden understanding of religion, which has laid the foundation of violent colonial rampages across the world. Also, the origin of Hamas is also considered by many, those who support the Palestinian cause, as an aberration and deviation from the Palestinian struggle for liberation. So they begin with, on the other hand, they don't understand the ideology and the vision behind the formation of Hamas, which existed long ago, even before the organization Harakatul Muqawama al Islamiyah, which we know as Hamas, was established formally. So we are here to discuss the idea of Hamas as an alternative when it comes to the question of decolonization of Palestine. Also, we will throw light on the history of liberation and the role of Hamas within it. So, I am very much obliged to invite Dr. Azam Tamimi to address the audience on the topic. And we will have a brief interaction after his talk. So we think we could finish in an hour or so. So we'll have the talk for 40 minutes. After that, we'll have a 20 to 25 minutes of interaction where we will take a handful of questions from the audience. So is it okay with you, Doctor?
Yes, yes,
Yes,
inshallah.
okay, okay, okay. So you may begin.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله ومن والاه. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate that very much. You see, at its basic level, the Palestinian issue is not something unprecedented in the history of humanity. The human memory might be short, and that's why it's important to go back to books of history and read about other nations' experiences. But so many nations before us, especially in recent history, were invaded and were occupied, and they suffered all sorts of atrocities perpetrated by the invaders. And the only way out of this is actually to struggle for freedom. It's a basic human right. So if you put aside all the misinformation and the disinformation and the stereotyping that is used to distort the truth about what's going on in Palestine, the issue of Palestine is not different from the issue of Vietnam when the people of Vietnam were struggling for their freedom from American imperialism. It's not different from the Algerian struggle when the Algerian people were struggling for freedom from French colonialism. The French colonized Algeria for 132 years. And the French thought that the time would never come for them to abandon Algeria. They actually annexed it. It became part of France. They sought to impose their culture and language and even their religion, if they could, on the people of Algeria. In many respects, the Zionist invasion and colonialism of Palestine has similarities with the apartheid regime in South Africa, a racist fascist regime that segregated people on the basis of their skin color. The whites came on top, followed by the Indians, followed by the colored, followed by the blacks, who were the majority, yet denied all their basic human rights. And like all previous struggles, the victims of colonialism are usually branded. Um, they get designated, labeled as terrorists, as barbaric, as savage, you call it. And these are necessary cliches in order to justify the ongoing murder committed by the invading forces. There's a book that I usually recommend to my audiences in this regard, which is really a very good book. It's called The Bible and Colonialism by Michael Pryor. Pryor, Prior. And in his book, Michael Pryor explains that the Bible was always used to justify the pillaging of other people's countries. And to illustrate this, he uses three examples. There's first the white European conquesta of what is today the Americas. Then there is the apartheid in South Africa. And finally, he deals with the Zionist occupation in Palestine. The crimes committed are very similar. The language used to justify is very similar. And in all cases, when Christian Europeans are involved, they use the Bible to justify their colonialism. Hence the title, The Bible and Colonialism. Many people think that what happens in Palestine is actually a conflict between the Muslims and the Jews, which is not true. It's far from it. I mean, the Jews lived in Muslim countries for 14 centuries, no problem whatsoever. This is a strictly European problem. Yes, Europe had a Jewish problem, but Muslims never had a Jewish problem. The Jews were the people of the book, they were Ahlul Kitab, and so long as they agreed to live in peace and harmony, they were respected and even protected. Unlike the situation in Europe, where the Jews were a burden on Europe and Europe wanted to get rid of them, they always persecuted them. And the European powers who won the war in the First World War seized the opportunity of the defeat of the Ottoman Empire to divide the lands of this empire among them and to implant right in the heart of that territory, which is known idiomatically as the Middle East, a foreign entity, a colonial outpost called they called Israel. Of course, they justified this in all manners and all ways, that this was to compensate the Jews for their persecution, for the Holocaust, etc. But actually, the Zionist movement started in Europe long before the Holocaust and long before the rise of the Nazis. It started around the latter quarter of the 19th century. And the founders of Zionism were mostly Ashkenazi secular Jews who were rejected by the majority of the Jewish community around the world, because the rest of the Jews thought of Zionism as a threat to their peaceful coexistence in the countries in which they were living. Now, since Israel was created in Palestine, I mean, to cut the story short, um, the Palestinians have been struggling. Of course, in the early stages, this wasn't seen as an attack on Palestine and the Palestinians. It was seen as an attack on the Muslims, on the Muslim Ummah, because Palestine was never a state, was never a country at any time in its history. It was always part of the Muslim Ummah, irrespective of the political order that prevailed at this time or that time. Later on, it was downgraded into an Arab issue. And eventually, with the rise of the PLO and the Fatah movement, it was downgraded further into a Palestinian issue. It's as if the Arabs were saying to the Palestinians, and many Muslims, regrettably, it's nothing to do with us. This is your issue. I'm talking here about governments, of course, not the peoples. We have to make a distinction between the two. Governments, generally, who were the creation of the post-colonial order, wanted to say to the Palestinians, it's your land, it's your cause, go ahead and do with it whatever you want. And that's why when the PLO in 1993 decided to make peace with Israel, everybody said, oh, you cannot be more Palestinian than the Palestinians. The Palestinians have decided to make peace with Israel, so why shouldn't we? But going back to earlier times, the Palestinians never stopped the struggle. The generation of my grandfather struggled, the generation of my father struggled, my generation, the generation of now of people who are the age of my children and my grandchildren are also struggling. And in each phase, there was a project, there was an umbrella under which that struggle took place. Hamas came into existence in 1987, together with the eruption of the Palestinian Intifada, or the Palestinian uprising. Prior to that, Hamas, the precursor to Hamas, was the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun, who actually did do their best in 1948 and struggled and offered many martyrs, but then realized afterwards that the balance of power regionally as well as internationally was not in their favor, and therefore they should focus more on reforming society in the hope that one day that society will be qualified and equipped with the qualities to enable it to lead the struggle for liberation. But in 1987, after the whole of Palestine was occupied 20 years earlier in 1967. And with the situation becoming really dire in Palestine, the Muslim Brotherhood decided on the 9th of December 1987 to transform themselves from the Palestinian branch or chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood into Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya Hamas, Islamic resistance movement in Palestine. And the reason for this is that the PLO, which was supposed to be the representative of the Palestinians in the struggle for liberation, decided to give up on the struggle. And they started to open back channels with Israel, with the United States, offering to recognize Israel in exchange of some sort of sovereignty somewhere, anywhere, on any territory inside Palestine. And it wasn't doing what it was supposed to do in terms of deterring the Israelis from continuing to commit crimes against the Palestinians under occupation. So it seemed at the time that Hamas was the timely alternative, was the leader of the new phase in the struggle. And since then, Hamas has been in a continuous battle with the Zionists. So many of its leaders were martyred, were assassinated, in several wars, attempts to exterminate it, and all of this really failed. And what they are trying to do at the moment, as you see in Gaza, is to kill as many Palestinians in Gaza as possible, seizing on the opportunity that the rest of the Arab world is doing nothing, that the rest of the Muslim world is doing very little, and that the people of Gaza are imprisoned in this narrow strip of land, and aided by neighboring Arab countries who are collaborating with Israel, I regret to say. So they want to kill as many Palestinians as possible in the hope that they can force Hamas leadership to hoist the white flag, to surrender. And I think from my knowledge of Hamas and my understanding, that this is very unlikely to happen. But in a worst case scenario, even if the people of Gaza are wiped out, even if they are depopulated, if they are sent out to Sinai as the Israelis say they wanted to do initially, before they were objected to by some regional as well as international actors, this cause will not be over. This is a struggle for liberation that will continue. Just as I mentioned earlier, the Algerians continued for 132 years to struggle. The Vietnamese people continued to struggle. The South African people continued to struggle. The people of India, remember, struggled against British colonialism. Various nations in Africa, in Latin America, etc. And we shouldn't really be intimidated by the fact that Israel is unconditionally supported by the United States of America and some of its European allies. That really doesn't matter, because before that they did support French colonialism, and they did support the apartheid regime in South Africa to the extent that Nelson Mandela once was designated as a terrorist, and Margaret Thatcher vowed that he'd never be allowed to set foot on British soil. And now we know the result. After apartheid came to an end in the early 90s, Nelson Mandela was elected head of state in the new South Africa, and he arrived in the UK and traveled around the world and was given a hero's welcome. What really matters to us is to know the facts. And I want to encourage our Muslim brothers and sisters and freedom-loving people, freedom and justice-loving people around the world, is to go back and read about the facts of this conflict. It helps you a lot if you are a sympathizer with the Palestinian plight, and it is, of course, a tragedy that attracts sympathy from all decent human beings around the world, as we are seeing from reactions in the social media in particular. Yet, when you know the facts, you can argue better. You can serve the cause in a much better way. And because there was in the past and continues until today to be a lot of myths about this conflict. I remember once I was on a lecture tour in Pakistan, and I went to Lahore, to Karachi, to Islamabad, to Peshawar. And when I was in Karachi, an enthusiastic Pakistani Muslim came to me and said that he was proud he funded the printing of the document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And I didn't know at the time whether to really laugh or cry, because that was a disaster. Many Muslims resort to this document in order to explain the conflict, whereas this document is a fake document. It was used by Hitler to justify the Holocaust. It was used by the Russians to justify the pogroms against the Jews. It's a very anti-Semitic fake document, and we should never allow ourselves to use such fake documents in our arguments. And that's why in my book, where in the first chapter I give a brief account of the history of the cause, then in the second chapter I talk about the birth and rise of Hamas, and so on. I dedicate one whole chapter to criticizing the first charter of Hamas that was published in 1988 without scrutiny, without proper attention, and which continues to be used by Zionists around the world a lot more than it is used by Hamas supporters to prove that Hamas is anti-Semitic, because it relies on Jewish conspiracy theory. It quotes the documents known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And that's why I would really strongly recommend a recent book that was published in London several months ago by my dear friend, Professor Avi Shleim of Oxford University, whom, by the way, I interviewed, and you can find the interview on Al Hiwar TV YouTube channel. It's in English with Arabic subtitles. I interviewed him several times, actually, because he's an expert on the Balfour Declaration. He's an expert on the history of the conflict in Palestine. But several months ago, I interviewed him specifically about his book, whose title is Three Worlds, Memoirs of an Iraqi Jew. And he explains the sort of relationship that existed in Iraq between the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims for thousands of years. And he explains also how the Jews of Iraq were expelled out of Iraq, not by the Muslims, not by the Arabs, but actually through a conspiracy hatched by the Zionist movement and by the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence in particular. Because after Israel was created in 1948, they were in a dire need for more population, and they couldn't convince many Jews to migrate to Palestine. So they hatched conspiracies against the Jews of Egypt, Iraq, and Yemen, and other places in order to frighten them away from the countries in which they've been living for hundreds of years, and to go to Israel under the illusion that Israel was the safest place on earth for the Jewish people. I personally have many Jewish friends, both Orthodox, like our dear friends from the Naturi Carta, who reject Zionism and consider the Zionists to be heretical and infidels, as well as from the secular side, people like Ilan Pape, a great writer on the Palestinian issue. I would recommend his books as well. Avi Shleim, Ilan Pape, Miko Peled. I mentioned Ilan Pape, but Miko Peled, a great friend who lives in the United States of America and who is today, after serving in the Israeli army, and whose father was a general, one of the founders of Israel, defected from Zionism and is today fighting against Zionism in America. He wrote a book, a brilliant book, which I also recommend. It's called The General's Son. So just to conclude, there are a number of books I would really strongly recommend. I repeat, you have my book, Hamas Unwritten Chapters, in the British edition. In the American edition, it's called Hamas, A History from Within. It's the same book, but two different titles, is Avi Shleim's several books. Avi Shleim wrote several excellent books, but the very last of which is Three Walls, Memoirs of an Iraqi Jew. Elan Pape has several excellent books as well. There's a book by John Rose called The Myths of Zionism, in which he explains that the founding fathers of Zionism, who heavily relied on the Bible to justify their project, actually didn't believe in the Bible. They were atheists. People like Tudor Herzl, like Ben Gurion, and Weizmann, and all those founding fathers of the Zionist movement and the state of Israel. There are also the writings of Professor Abdul Wahab al-Misiri. If you read Arabic, his books in Arabic are the best authority on the history of the conflict and on the Jews, Judaism, and Zionism. Actually, he has an 8-volume encyclopedia in Arabic with this title. There's a book about the history of the cause. It's called The Palestine Question, or The Question of Palestine, I forgot exactly, by someone called Henry Cottan, Cottan. So, to conclude, I want to encourage you to really read. Knowledge is the strongest weapon one can use to serve this cause, and ignorance is the worst thing that can happen to any of us, because sometimes we think we are serving the cause, but actually we are not serving it at all. I think I better stop here and allow for more time for discussion. Let me just get some water. Yes, you can go ahead now.
Sure. So, I would like to begin with a very crucial question at the moment, because we find a lot of misinformation floating around, especially on the social media, regarding the origins of Hamas. So, I wanted to ask you, especially when one article which was written by the journalist Mehdi Hassan, who tried to distort the history of the origin of Hamas. And that article is now again doing rounds on social media, because many of them claim that the origin of Hamas in the history of the struggle of liberation in Palestine is sort of an aberration, or sort of a deviation from what it actually used to. So they want to call Hamas as something which doesn't have a prehistory, or something which born all of a sudden without a legacy. So I want you to specifically contextualize the origin of Hamas and the place of Hamas in its ideology and the way how it operates. So I would like you to throw more light on it.
Well, I used to have respect for Mahdi Hassan, but and I even once appeared on his show. But I really regret seeing him fall into this trap so easily. Someone like him, an ambitious journalist, should have checked the facts, should have consulted people who have knowledge, rather than just copy and paste some of the allegations made by the enemies of Hamas. This idea that Hamas was created by Israel or was assisted by Israel uh, actually came from the PLO, because when the PLO saw the emergence of Hamas, they were taken by surprise on what's going on. They thought they were the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians. And now there seemed to be someone who is proving to be more genuine than them. So they said, "Oh, where were you before when we were struggling? You were not doing any resistance." And it's true, of course. Before, Hamas was the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is not a resistance movement. It's a it's a social reform movement. Uh, and because they were not involved in the resistance, they were not necessarily targeted by the Israelis. Although, of course, in 1983, about 4 years before 4 or 5 years before the formal creation of Hamas, there was an attempt on the part of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, which I also explain in my book, to start a resistance effort. And he was arrested together with Salah Shahada and several leaders of the movement, and they were imprisoned. And a few years later, they were released in a prisoners' exchange. Now, nobody wants to talk about this, uh, but it's really a ludicrous claim, because how come that the Israelis in 1987 create Hamas allegedly to undermine the PLO, and then several months later, in 1988, they start cracking down on the movement, killing its leaders and arresting them, and then later on deporting them to South Lebanon? So the facts of history are there for everybody to see. And I really wish that if Mahdi Hassan hears me, uh, that he repents from that sin he committed and the injustice he perpetrated against a noble cause.
Adding to that, one more thing that I wanted to ask you. Before that, I request everyone from the audience, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand. Okay. While we were talking about the role of different parties in the struggle for the liberation of Palestine, to frame it in a way, to call it anti-colonial, uh, in my view, in my perspective, I think Hamas is doing a service, or Hamas is currently operationalizing a struggle which is the most anti-colonial, especially the allegations against Hamas, which comes from the Muslim world. Uh, Often, when the Hamas is subjected to a sort of isolation, claiming that what Hamas does is more harm in magnitude rather than a service to the Palestinian people as well as the Ummah in large. But what I find is the Muslim nations, while they are limited and restricted to the limitations of nation state and their ambitions, having being able to do nothing in the with regards to the cause, Hamas is actually disrupting the order and subverting the colonial order by taking it back to the pre-colonial roots, where there used to be a common sentiments among the Muslims, especially as what you have said, when the entire land of Sham was undivided and it was under the caliphate. So, how do you think the legacy of, especially when it comes to the even the name of the Qassam brigades, who are currently the militant wing of Hamas, the name goes back to Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam, whose legacy we all know, who led a battalion against the colonial forces. So the legacy and the ideology goes back to that, and which also disrupts the current order, the colonial order, which is trying to claim the supremacy. So, how do you think Hamas, I mean, the ideology and the vision of Hamas could be explained to the people who are trying to claim that Hamas is something which is uh, doing something in isolation, which is doing something which is in deviance to what the Muslim world wants to do?
Well, whatever is said about Hamas in this regard has been said about uh, people who struggled for freedom in many other places before them. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, the Viet Cong in Vietnam were terrorists to the Americans and their supporters. Nelson Mandela and the ANC were terrorists in the eyes of many countries around the world, but also in the eyes of some South Africans who agreed to collaborate with the apartheid regime. Same with Algeria. Now remember, even prophets, when the prophets were sent to their people, what did they what how were they labeled initially? What sort of designation was given to them? that they were sabotaging, that they were destroying the fabric of society, that they were collaborating with some alien agencies. And all of this is part of a campaign to discredit a very credible project, which is the struggle for liberation. And the best way to answer all of this is to know the facts, to go back to the books of history and read. And just give you a brief example. I was once giving a talk at King's College in London, and I mentioned the fact that the Iraqi Jews were driven out of Iraq not by the Arabs or the Muslims, but by the Zionists through a conspiracy hatched by the Mossad. Um, and two Jewish students in the audience protested and said, "Liar, liar." Uh, Before I answered back, um, a gentleman stood in the hall and introduced himself as a professor of history at the university. And he said to them, "Shame on you. All you need to do is just go to the library and read about the history of this issue. What Dr. Tamimi is saying is the truth. This is exactly what happened." So history is on our side, is on the side of the victims of colonialism. It's just a question of knowing these facts of history.
Now, another question that is often raised while with regards to the modus operandi of Hamas is that while during the origin of during the formation of Hamas, we know the major disagreement with PLO with regards to even the Oslo Accords was that it was legitimizing the existence of Israel in a sense and gaining and giving them the legitimacy to exist as a sovereign state. So, how do we locate the idea of the truth is that the Hamas is trying to operationalize in negotiation with Israel, as well as the interaction of Hamas with the Palestinian Authority being elected as a democratic power in Gaza in 2006, and so. So, how do we reconcile all these moves, especially the idea of the truce also heading a government which is born to be an authority which is subservient to a greater colonial power. How do we locate?
Well, to understand this, we need to go to the context of any event. In 2005, uh, the Israelis decided to withdraw unilaterally from Gaza. This was the crowning of the second intifada that started in September 2000. So when the Israelis decided to withdraw unilaterally from Gaza, under Sharon, who was the prime minister of Israel at the time, and Sharon declared Oslo to be dead, Hamas agreed to join in the political process, having come to the conclusion that Oslo was no longer working, because the Israelis themselves declared Oslo to be dead. Oslo is the 1993 agreement between the PLO and Israel, according to which the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist in exchange for recognizing the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians. And the Israelis continued to just build settlements and persecute the Palestinians and use the Palestinian Authority as a security tool. But because of the Intifada of 2000, much of this was at the time shaken, and Yasser Arafat himself regretted he did Oslo and collaborated with Hamas. And that's why he was killed eventually by the Israelis. Um, so the context in which Hamas joined the elections in 2006 was one in which there seemed to be no more Oslo. and the Palestinians needed to join ranks, work together, and hopefully uh, pave the way for a political struggle for their rights. So the struggle can adopt all shapes and manners. Uh, of course, now we know that those elections in 2006 were conducted under pressure from George W. Bush. George W. Bush, having invaded Iraq in 2003, wanted to improve his image by having uh, some countries that were loyal to him to show signs of democratization. So he wanted to have elections in Iraq. He wanted to have elections in other places, including in the Palestinian Authority. And Mahmoud Abbas at the time told him that this was risky because Hamas could win. And George Bush said, no, 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 no. Our information is that it's highly unlikely Hamas will win. Your people will win. But actually, Hamas won the elections. From then on, Hamas had to work within the milieu, the political milieu in which it found itself. A year later, the Americans, unhappy with the Hamas victory and Hamas' refusal to accept the conditions that the so-called world community sought to impose on it, which are known as the quartet conditions, sent General Dayton to Gaza to collaborate with Mahmoud Abbas's men and topple the Hamas government. And there was a fight, there was a war, a brief civil war between Hamas and Fatah in 2007. It was in June 2007. And that resulted in Hamas being in charge of Gaza and Fatah being in charge of the West Bank. So Gaza immediately was put under siege. That's why it's been under siege for the past 17 years. While the West Bank continued to be under occupation, an occupation that is guarded by the troops of the Palestinian Authority as well as the occupation troops. So once again, I stress the importance of facts, going back to the facts of history to understand what actually went on. History doesn't begin today. History didn't begin yesterday. History is a very long process. It started with our father Adam when it comes to the history of humanity, of course. And therefore, whenever you want to talk about a series of events that are linked, you need to go back to the starting point. So, where is the starting point? For me, the starting point of the Zionist project is in Europe in the middle of the 19th century. The starting point of the plight of the Palestinians is with the British mandate in Palestine in the early 20s of the last century, and so on. That's how you explain things. And you mentioned Sheikh Azzuddin Qassam. Azzuddin Qassam was actually from Syria, and he came to Palestine to struggle against British colonialism initially. And he was assassinated by the British. And he symbolized what Palestine meant to the Ummah, because this is an issue for the Ummah, not just an issue for the Palestinians. Downgrading the issue, as I mentioned earlier, did a great deal of harm to it. And in 1948, there were volunteers from various parts of the Muslim world who came and joined the struggle against Zionism. And I can assure you that had it not been for the immediate neighborhood, those Arab regimes that are colluding with Israel to provide it with security, volunteers would have come from all parts of the world to rescue the Palestinians. Unfortunately, this is the reality. We have the reality in which the Palestinians are deserted, are left alone. And the first to blame for this are the Arabs.
We have a few questions in the comment box. It's in the text form. So, one of the questions I'll read it out for you. So, the first question is regarding the support of Zionists among Sephardic Jews and their exodus from Muslim societies. The questioner is asking, Rashid Al Kailani, for instance, has been alleged to have involved in their exodus from Iraq. Similarly, local Jews of Hebron are said to have emptied by the eve of 1947 war, so to say the Jews of Yemen. This is the first question that he wants to ask. The second question, there are three questions. I'll try to club it together. He's asking why uh, not consider the PLO as a reality, which is set up by the Arab regimes to contain the issue, and Hamas uh, traced to Amin al Husseini. And another question he wants to ask is that how is the struggle of about 10 groups, how it got just diminished to single group, that is Hamas. And also his another question is about the role of leftist resistant groups in the Palestine, such as the Popular Front of Liberation. So all are these. The first question is regarding the support of Zionists among Sephardic Jews and the reality of that claims. And the second question is regarding how the resistance got diminished to Hamas alone. So you can take questions one by one.
Well, initially, as I mentioned, most Jews around the world were opposed to Zionism, whether they were Ashkenazim or Sephardim. But of course, later on, things changed when the Sephardim were driven out of many of the Arab countries in which they were living. uh, they were integrated into the Zionist regime. Initially, they were discriminated against. There's a famous scandal of known as the Black Blood, when the Ethiopian Jews were donating their blood. That blood was rejected by the Ashkenazim because they said, "Well, we couldn't accept black blood because Zionism is racist in its origins." However, later on, you could hardly distinguish between the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim. It just became, and now today we have a new phenomenon which was born out of the settlement movement, which is known as the religious Zionism, which is a contradiction in terms, theoretically speaking, because Zionism is supposed to be secular and atheist, but now you have a new breed of Zionists who espouse Zionism in a religious fashion. People like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who are today ministers in Netanyahu's government and who want to wipe out the entire Palestinian population. Ben Gvir is originally Iraqi from Kurdistan, or his ancestors actually were from Iraq. Um, so context is very important. Uh, Things develop with the passage of time. Um, it's just like the PLO. I mean, the PLO was created by the Arab countries, not by the Palestinians. It was created by the Arab League, uh, and in 1964. But later on, it was taken over by Fatah, the major Palestinian faction. Fatah, its founders in the beginning were ex-members of the Muslim Brotherhood. Most of them, actually, except Yasser Arafat. Everybody among the founders, except Yasser Arafat, were members of the Muslim Brotherhood. So they were motivated by their Islamic sentiment as well as their patriotism. But then, with the passage of time, they changed. They were told, they were convinced that if you continue to be identified with Islam, that is not going to help your cause. And actually, it didn't help their cause anyway. Um, um, Now, um, that's why, moving to the other question, Hamas is not alone in this struggle. Hamas is the major faction, it is true. But Islamic Jihad is also joining in the battle. The PFLP is joining in this battle. Uh, but it is an overwhelmingly now becoming uh, a Hamas thing, because Hamas is the biggest group, is the most organized, because it is the group that launched the attack on 7 October. So there are really a number of factors involved. Um, and today, Palestinians with various backgrounds, some are leftists, some are nationalists, some are Islamists, seem to come closer because they can now see that Hamas has been vindicated in its uh, categorization of the project of Zionism in Palestine.
Okay, the very fact that the other groups that are operational and functional in the Palestine is now has joined Hamas and has been favoring the operations of Hamas is also a sign that the stance of Hamas stands vindicated uh, in the history of the liberation of Palestine. Another question that came to the comment box is a question which I also want to comment on. It's like he's asking why Hamas is not internationalizing the struggle, unlike other leftist revolutionary movements across the world. Uh, what do you have to comment with regards to that question?
I think the experiment of internationalizing the struggle by the PFLP in particular, and the perpetration of operations around the world, including hijacking of aircrafts, etc., wasn't really very helpful for the Palestinian cause. Um, it might have introduced the cause to a wider um, circle around the world, but it wasn't really very helpful. That's why Hamas focuses principally on the struggle inside Palestine.
Also, I think Hamas has the double burden when it comes to the process of internationalization. Uh, the most, uh, the closest wards or the most intimate partners who could be in this cause are the Muslim, Arab and Muslim nations. Also, when the Hamas has the double burden to clean its image in front of the public when it comes to even the charter that you have been discussing, the charter of 1987. And every time when Hamas makes a move or Hamas put forward a decision, that decision has to be explained in various ways because also as I have said, the leftist movements they don't have the burden to answer the question that are often put forward by the secular front because there is this overwhelming tendency to secularize the struggle and also to vilify the struggle only because of the reason that it is driven by the values of Islam per se. So I think this double burden is also making it difficult. Also, the stagnancy among the Arab Muslim nations to intervene in the issue. I think the questions, if there are no more questions, I think it's time we could end the discussion with a brief remark from the speaker.
Well, I just would like to say that I'm grateful for this opportunity, and let's not forget our brothers and sisters in Gaza in our dua, in our prayers. Uh, and we pray for an immediate end to the current carnage that is causing so much pain in
Me.
Gaza.
So before we end, I would like to ask you one more thing, Dr. Azzam Tamimi. That is, how do you see the current development? I mean, the second round uh, of carnage that is happening after the truce. How do you see from the point of view of Hamas as well as the people who are the well-wishers of Hamas? How do you see this war, especially the second round of rampage and attacks that are going on right now? Something that is happening in desperation when they are not able to wipe out the presence of Hamas. So, how do you see the future? How do you see the current stage and the current state in which the resistance is acting?
Well, indeed, you've just really stated it. It's the Israelis are acting out of frustration, out of vengeance. They don't seem to have a strategy except killing as many Palestinians as possible in the hope that this will force them to surrender. And this is unlikely to happen. Uh, of course, on the humanitarian side, it's very painful, it's catastrophic, there's no question about it. But the resistance is doing very well. And the news we get from the resistance inside Gaza is that they are inflicting heavy losses on the Israelis.
So I would like to end with this. I once again thank Dr. Azam Tamimi for accepting our humble invitation and spending time with us. We look forward to have more and more interactions in the future, inshallah. And
Inshallah. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
okay,
Assalamu alaikum.
wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.